and welcome to Season 10, Episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We're, of course, reading the Thomas Sowell Reader, reading some of the best articles from Thomas Sowell, this time finishing up the section on race and ethnicity with just a couple articles this time, but some longer ones where he goes into more detail on these two topics. One is, they're really sort of both, I guess, kind of world or history based. One is affirmative action around the world, sort of comparing different affirmative action programs, where they've ended up in different countries. And the other's about the impact of geography on economics and things like that. So more of just an expanded article, because he talked about that a little bit in a few previous articles. This one really goes into depth with some specific regions and stuff like that. I thought these were both great. Really well said, and both of them really well researched, obviously. Some really interesting points he makes throughout.
Yeah, and it really gives you, and I recommend this to anybody if you can get these, get this book. Of course, the book's great, but it really takes the sting out of racial discrimination issues in a sense, because especially the geography
Mm-hmm.
around the world, where he explains, and it's a lot of it's common sense, but it's based upon research and studies and the effect of well, I'm kind of skipping ahead, but the effect of certain geographical limitations as far as transportation and on a culture, and it really it helps explain disparities between groups of people where it has nothing to do with moral worth. It has nothing to do with them as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
As an individual among the group, it's not like, well, this is a bad person or this is a dumb person or it helps to explain how you can end up with a group of people that have a lower output, I guess you'd say,
Mm-hmm.
or and so it's I think it's just so helpful, and I wish we'd have more discussion of this in the public sphere and public policy, because if you address some of these concerns, and of course the first article that we're going to cover is the government's policies trying to do affirmative action around the world and how it doesn't work or hasn't worked when you do it in a certain way, where you're just trying to in theory giving the people the grace that they are well intentioned. If they're intending to have a positive impact, it ends up not really working out if you're not focusing on the right things. And
Yeah.
and I just wish we had the ability. There's always this. I haven't heard in probably a year where an advocate, some racialist advocate, will say we need to have a conversation about race. Okay, all right. I think now they're not saying it because everybody's like, all right, let's have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And let's have an honest conversation, which they really don't want to have. They just want to lecture people.
Yeah.
And I think an honest conversation would say, well, there's a lot of things going on that cause disparate impact among groups, and we, meaning humans, have tried a number of different ways to try to help underprivileged or underperforming groups.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what these two articles talk about.
Yeah.
And they haven't worked. And so, okay, let's talk about what's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways.
Yeah, because I
So
like I like what he says.
the
Because going into the affirmative action one here, I feel like we
yes,
think about that a lot as a very specifically Western thing, or if not like American thing, with the
right.
American universities. But he points out it's really all over the place.
Yes.
He says, and especially the point he makes is some group preferences have existed for minorities, some for majorities, some for the less fortunate, and some for the more fortunate who feel entitled to maintain their existing advantages over other members of the same society. And kind of lists a bunch of countries there. But
Yes.
then he makes the really important distinction on 288, just before we kind of get into the sort of details. He says official affirmative action or group preference policies must be distinguished from whatever purely subjective preferences or prejudices may exist among individuals and groups. These subjective feelings may of course influence policies, but the primary focus here is on concrete government policies and their empirical consequences, not in their rationales, hopes, or promises, though these latter considerations will not be wholly ignored.
Yes.
And that's a good point, because you see that a lot with sort of the pro affirmative action side. As you see, well, white people have this and this advantage because of this quote from this person who said that he really hates black people. It's like,
Yes.
okay, well maybe, and surely it's at points in American history there have been use of government action against black people and slaves and things like that. But sort of in the modern context, you don't have any of that. But you see that a lot. It's like, well, these people feel this certain way because well, that's not an official government policy, and
Yeah.
prejudices do exist for sure, but that's a very different thing, and we're talking about government policy here.
Yeah. And he continues, and I emphasize the next sentence,
Yeah.
which is he says, fundamentally, however, this is a study of what actually happens rather than a philosophical exploration of issues that have been amply, if not more than amply, explored elsewhere.
Hmm.
And that's what I really appreciated about what he's doing, especially in these two articles, because he's taken that morality and the good bad out of it, and he's trying to look at effective ineffective.
Hmm.
What's a cause other than people can be bad, right?
Hmm.
Because that's kind of a given and it's discussed everywhere. So this is such a like a refreshing exploration of these topics because it really is important, because I completely understand when people say, well, especially like if you look at like some neighborhoods, like even in our community, a couple of neighborhoods that'll be just so the people are just so downtrodden,
Yeah.
and they feel hopeless. Like there's certain neighborhoods in North St. Louis area or North St. Louis County that man, if I lived there, I'd be thinking that, somebody put us down.
Hmm.
Somebody's keeping us down by making us live in this area. Because if you look at it, it's just so depressing. And something, there are things that should be done to improve their lives, especially the lives of the children, so that they are not condemned to live in a violent neighborhood and
Yeah.
grow up in and to give them opportunities. And if we can get out of the well, if we can get out of the who's at fault and have this philosophical moral argument later and just talk, okay, let's see what have we done? I mean, we people have done to try to improve people's lives as groups. And if it has worked, let's try it. And if it
Yeah.
hasn't, let's get rid of it.
Yeah.
Let's not even go down those. And so the first section is the limited and transient
Hmm.
preferences. So he's talking about, well, they're temporary or they're limited in some areas. Of course, if you have a limited or a temporary, then they never end up being temporary
Yeah, and
or
that, that's his point because he says, for India, he says, we're going to have lower university admission standards for the untouchables, for in the caste system. Members of disadvantaged groups, but he says he's not recommending relaxation for admission and not for passing or grading. But then, of course, as time goes on, we see that change. And he makes the
yeah,
really good point about the United States with the original affirmative action policies were outreach efforts,
yes,
essentially like marketing. He says, yeah, similar reasoning was applied in the United States to both employment and admissions to college and universities. Initially, it was proposed that there would be special outreach efforts to contact minority individuals with information and encouragement to apply for jobs or college admissions in places where they might not have felt welcome before, but with the proviso that they would not be given special preferences throughout the whole subsequent process of acceptance and advancement. And of course,
yes. And
that's
I'm old enough to remember it. That's what
yeah.
was authorized. That was passed. They promised we are not going to treat anybody differently. We are merely informing people of the opportunity and telling them that they are able to apply equally and they will not be discriminated against. And what's wrong with
Hmm.
that? There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not what it turned into, of course.
Yeah. And he traces that in Malaysia too. He says that was sort of the same approach.
Yeah.
He says, although grading is supposed to be without reference to ethnicity, all grades must be submitted to an evaluation review committee having heavy Malay representation.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, we have to check the grades that you're giving people on this committee that's clearly going to be biased towards one group. And so it's like ostensibly it's this limited, transit thing. It's not going to be forever, but then it just balloons into something else and sort of creeps into other areas of the university or the market and things like that, where it's just not at all what you promised in the first place.
Yeah. And I was fascinated by some of the examples he provided because I wasn't even aware of the like the policies in Pakistan,
Hmm.
which provided some temporary benefit to poor Bengalis of East Pakistan who are underrepresented in business, and those still persisted even after that region separated out
It became
from
Bangladesh, yeah.
Pakistan and became Bangladesh as a separate country. I wasn't even aware of any of that
Hmm.
happening, and they still had those preferences. And of course, like with the example of the untouchables, the class, which I don't even understand the Indian
Yeah.
culture, but I understand they had this subclass. They were so discriminated against; they're considered untouchable. Um, and it was just so horrible. It's laughable. You know, it's like an
Hmm.
absurd, terrible thing to do. But then people were gaming the system, or that they had other people that there were other classes that were underrepresented, and so they got preferential treatments. And so then people would. I think he even mentions. Doesn't he mention in this article? It's been a week since I read this one,
Hmm.
about like preferences for Native Americans, and of course that
Yeah.
encourages people to
Hmm.
it's like the number of Native Americans
Hmm.
expanded in the
Yeah.
same generation, from before that. The same generation of
Yeah.
one had a certain number, and then you have more of them like 2 years later or
Mhm. Yeah,
something.
that's the next
Yeah,
section he has is the preferred and non-preferred groups, and he talks about that versus the designation and redesignation. Um, yeah, this is what he says here. It says the number of individuals identifying themselves as American Indians in the U.S. Census during the affirmative action era rose at a rate exceeding anyone's estimates of the biological growth of this population. Moreover, a
yeah,
breakdown of census data by age cohort shows that the number of American Indians increased over time in the same age
each
cohort, a
cohort. Yeah,
biological impossibility made possible on paper by redesignation of the same individuals. And he goes on to say to go into the statistics. So the people aged 15 and 19, American Indians in 1960, was just under 50,000. But then 20 years later, looking at the bracket 35 to 39, which should be the same group of people, was more than
yeah,
80,000 people. So you somehow have 30,000 people appear out of nowhere
yeah.
in 20 years. And of course, that's because now you can claim, that identity and mark that on your job applications or your university applications and things like that. And depending on, the tribe you can have, because I think some say the cutoff is 1/16th. Indian. Some say it's even like 1/32nd. Some go like way far back. If you have like one great great grandparent, you can claim to be a member of a
I gotta
tribe.
tell you, when everybody starts talking about those kind of standards, that is just so closely connected to slave trade.
Yeah.
Like the racist policies in the South, the American South, and whether you are, an African descent. I don't even like talking about that
Hmm.
stuff. It's like, oh my God. And then, and of course, every time I read about these things, I have to think about Pocahontas, Senator Warren.
Hmm.
And boy, that epitaph, isn't that what you call it? That
Hmm.
insult,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that title has stuck to her like glue. I
Uh-huh.
mean, everybody in America knows if you mention Pocahontas, you're talking about Senator Elizabeth Warren and
Yeah.
how she got a job and got a promotion at that law school because she said she was Native American. She
Hmm.
would have never gotten that position without that uh,
Yeah.
fake claimed
Hmm.
ancestry.
Yeah, but it's really
And
funny. I think I've told you about one of my friends who I think is like 1/16th, maybe 1/8, like Cherokee, but he has an official card, from
yeah, for the tribe.
from the tribe. So he's a card carrying Indian, and he can
Yes.
mark that, when he applies for stuff. Well, it's, no, I have the card to prove it, which is just ridiculous because he doesn't really have. I mean, he knows his family, but he doesn't have too much connection with them. Let's say things like that. It's just so easy in many cases just to be like, oh, well, I'm part of this group now.
That's a whole weird area of law.
Yeah.
The with the Native Americans, because they're kind of like separate sovereigns
Hmm.
within the country, and it complicates adoption law.
Yeah.
So like there's a procedure you have to notify the tribe of any adoption of any child who is of Native American. You have to track down the tribe to see if they'll consent, because they may be able to assert the right to interject in an adoption,
Hmm.
uh, and bring the child into the tribe.
Yeah.
Uh, for if it's not a family member adoption, because if it's family, biological family member adoption, then of course you're going to be a member of the tribe
Hmm.
too. But a lot of these adoptions where the mother's a drug addict or whatever the case may be, you either have to put in your petition that the child is not of Native American heritage, or you have to notify the relevant tribe. It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. That's
Um,
crazy.
yeah, there's a whole bunch of special rules,
Hmm.
which I understand. I mean, we don't need to go down that
Yeah.
path, but he talks about like these other examples, like the Chinese and
Hmm.
the India stuff is so crazy. And I didn't know he mentions this. I meant to look it up. I forgot. He mentions in 1997, organized efforts were also begun to seek preferential treatment for India's 15 million eunuchs. Although obviously they were not the descendants of other eunuchs, and so could not inherit historic group disadvantages. I didn't know that there were like a whole bunch of eunuchs in a
Yeah,
country.
that's crazy. I had no idea that either. It's wild. I also like the example of
Is that? I wonder if it's still a thing. I mean, he's talking about 1997. I
yeah,
guess they
I
might,
mean,
yeah, still be alive,
lot
I
of them
guess.
still around. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I like what he says about the example in Indonesia and Malaysia, where businesses, right? You get benefits if your business is owned by a minority group. He says that it's acquired its own name for businesses that are run that way. He says the Alibaba Enterprises, where Ali is the indigenous individual who ostensibly owns the business and is legally entitled to government benefits, while Baba is the non-indigenous person, usually Chinese in these countries, who actually controls the enterprise and pays Ali, essentially use him like as a mascot.
Yeah.
And I've heard stories of people doing that with to get like the woman owned business
Oh, for
a
sure.
thing where
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I'll just write it down in my wife's name. I'll run the business, but to get sort of the woman owned business benefits and stuff like that because it's not even like government stuff.
Yeah.
On like Google Maps and stuff, it'll flag you and it'll promote you if you have like woman
Oh,
owned business. You could do it for like veteran owned business and stuff too. So it pops up like when you search and it's like one of the top little markers there. And so in some ways it helps like boost your search results if people are just Googling like places to go like within your town. It's like
I
that's a
should
really easy way to do that.
have our firm listed as a woman-owned business because 2/3 of it is owned by my female partners.
There you go.
I'm a women-owned business. That'd be great. I've had clients and it's usually in a field that has a lot of government contracts, federal
Hmm.
government contracts. So construction, hauling, road work type, where you talk about federal grants for constructing roads, bridges, and federal construction projects. Even if they're administered through the state, you can get a preference, and it's really it's I mean I don't know all the details on it, but I don't think it's a huge preference. But in those things, that it makes a difference in the margins. Like
Hmm.
you get some contracts that you wouldn't have otherwise, because a lot of times if you're all bidding it correctly, you're going to have a very similar price.
Yeah.
So all things being equal, you get the job and they don't.
Hmm.
Um, if you all bid it correctly, and it doesn't save anybody any money.
Yeah.
Um, but the women owned business gets it. Well, why is that? And everybody knows that's going on. Or the minority owned business, like you kind of described, where you have somebody who's the technical owner, has the ownership interest in it. But it's of course then it's dangerous if they have some sort of dispute.
Hmm.
You need to have a trustworthy minority that doesn't assert, well, wait a second, I run this place. I'm the
Hmm.
majority shareholder. I'm going to kick you out. And then all heck breaks loose, which is pretty entertaining. It
Yeah.
never happened with any of my clients,
No,
but
that's good. That's good. Yeah, I like what he says kind of within that, designation redesignation section. This is on 296. It says, insofar as affirmative action policies are aimed particularly at offsetting existing economic disadvantages, the rationale is undermined when the benefits of those policies go disproportionately to those individuals within the designated groups who are the least disadvantaged or perhaps are in more favorable positions than members of the country's general population. And he goes on to talk about, in India's state of Tamil Nadu, he says the highest of those so-called backward classes legally entitled to preferences, constituting 11% of the total amount of that class, received almost half of all jobs in university admissions. And same thing in Malaysia, where the families who are in the top 17% of the income distribution received just over half of all scholarships. So it's not really going to the most disadvantaged. It's going to the people who
right.
can fit within that group and are usually at the top of that group. So it's not helping those
Yes.
who are really, badly off and couldn't, make it on their own. It's going to those people who might be, middle class or lower middle class, who are receiving a lot of those benefits.
Yes. And he also talks about the incentives that this
Hmm.
causes, which is the next section. And I like this quote on 298. He says, both preferred and non-preferred groups can slacken their efforts. The former because working to their fullest capacity is unnecessary, and the latter because working to their fullest capacity can prove to be futile.
Hmm.
And so it has all these perverse incentives, both for the people that receive the benefit, because they're like, well, I can coast. I don't have to, I'm going to be able to get these preferential grants. And then the other people just give up.
Hmm.
It's like some portion of the other side are going to give up because like, well, they're going to get it anyway, and
Yeah.
it's terrible.
Hmm.
And anyway, and then he talks about intergroup relations, which of course is obvious to anybody who pays
Mm-hmm.
attention to it, that there are social losses due
Yeah.
to intergroup resentments, and it's well, I like and we're seeing it in real time. Like there was a plane that crashed in Canada. Was
Mm-hmm.
it a week or so ago? And and the first thing you see on the internet is who's the pilot, you know? And if it's some dude about my age who's a
Mm-hmm.
white male, they'll think, oh, there must have been a mechanical failure or something,
Yeah.
or there's some, mistake or whatever, but it's not because of preferential treatment. Now, of course, in that example, it turned out it was a 26-year-old female.
Mm-hmm.
And like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
If it was a 26-year-old white male, would I have a different view of it? That it maybe some wonderkind, like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, what, that maybe there's a 26-year-old female pilot that's if we all knew that the standards were harder for women to become pilots, like it was 20% harder for them to become pilots than it would be for a man to become a pilot, I'd be like, man, I want a woman pilot,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I know that they have a harder time getting there. But it creates this perception, and it's so self-defeating. It defeats the purpose of the incentives
Mm-hmm.
and the preferential treatment, because it creates this cloud
Yeah.
that they would not have, because it used to be. I'm old enough to know or remember when it used to be. If there was a person who is like, so it would have been before my era, because there was a civil rights law passed before I was born. So like you knew if there was a black medical doctor
Mm-hmm.
that got a degree in the 1940s, that dude was sharp,
Mm-hmm.
because they overcame so much to get to that position. They had
Yeah.
to fight through it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this guy or this woman, even a woman, like a woman lawyer that got through law school, because there were a few that got through law school, early on before, uh, before it was, now it's mostly women coming out of law school. But back then it's like, then that woman was the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she had to be like smarter than all the men
Mm-hmm.
to overcome the prejudice and all that. And so it had a kind of like a weird, you earned the respect.
Yeah.
And everybody knew that person had to have been super great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the first baseball players,
Yeah.
baseball players played in Major League Baseball. They were the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
but now you have these. If there's preferences for any group, you're thinking that we're not getting their best.
Mm-hmm.
We may be getting their best.
Yeah.
We might.
Because
We might, but I don't know.
yeah. He makes a really good point because he says, any people who criticize, affirmative action policies, people are really quick to characterize them as, the quote, angry white males. It's you guys are just, really resentful of people taking your privilege and stuff like that. And it's going to different spots. He points out, at the beginning of this subsection that really, if you look at the universities, whites, quote unquote, lost more places to Asian Americans than they did to any black people. The higher percentage was taken up by Asian Americans, but you don't see any of that, criticism and sort of animus against the Asian Americans, because he says it was not the intergroup transfer of benefits that was resented, but the basis for those transfers, right? It's like it's this weird, governmental policy that says, well, no, we have to give up these slots to these different people. And he has a really good point. Talking about India, he's quoting this. He says, "This observer of preferential policies in India, the disproportionate resentment of places reserved for scheduled castes, which is the euphemism for the untouchables." This is really good when I'll read this block quote here. He says, "We hear innumerable tales of persons being deprived of appointments in favor of people who ranked lower than they did in the relevant examinations. No doubt this does happen, but if all these people were, in fact, paying the price for appointments to scheduled castes, there would be many more scheduled caste persons appointed than there actually are. To illustrate, supposing that 300 people qualify for 10 posts available. The top 9 are appointed on merit, but the 10th is reserved so that the authorities go down the list to find a scheduled caste applicant. They find one at 140, and he is appointed, 140th in the list. Whereupon all 131 between him and the merit list feel aggrieved. He has not taken 131 posts, he has taken one. Yet
Mm,
131 people believe they have paid the price for it. Moreover, the remaining 159 often also resent the situation, believing that their chances were somehow lessened by the existence of scheduled caste reservations. And that's a
yes.
great point because you hear that critique, from people defending these. And so it's only these these very few spots, and it really doesn't impact that much, and things like that. And so, well, you're creating this whole perception. Again, it's that those 131 people, between the 140th person and the 10th person, right? It's you're not just picking the 10 most qualified. You're picking someone from farther down the list, potentially, maybe not. We don't really know for certain, but the fact that these policies exist create those angry 131 people that all feel particularly personally aggrieved by this policy, and you see that everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, it's just counterproductive
Hmm.
in the short term and especially over the long term, because it just creates more problems than it solves. I mean,
Hmm.
what we really should be doing is just trying to make sure that everybody has the same opportunity, so that when they are examined, it's fair and they get a fair shot at doing it. And then everybody respects the outcome. But
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's so obvious, but it's so infrequently discussed, especially among the left and among the government class. But
Yeah.
I repeat myself.
Yeah. And then I think the last section in this article here is just about the trends. And this
Yes.
is important too. And he makes a really good point. I'll just talk about the example from the United States.
Yeah.
But he says the proportion of the black population going to college doubled in the 2 decades
Mhm.
preceding the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. This was reflected in the occupational rise of blacks. And he says, and that's often cited, post, Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like, look how many more people, black people, were in academia or had jobs and things like that. He says it's an almost totally ignored fact that the proportion of blacks in such occupations rose even more substantially in the years preceding passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah.
It's like this idea, and I think he talks about that in there, is that we have a completely static society until the government puts change into the system, and anything good that
Yes.
happens after that point is because of this government-induced change. It's like nobody lives in a static system anywhere. Everything's always changing, and to just focus on this one policy, this one initiative, as the cause for everything good, or on the opposite end of everything bad, is just ignoring all of the historical context and everything else that's going on in the society at the time. And he runs through some other statistics from some other
Right.
countries and stuff like that. But it's a similar thing. It's like you have a trend that's occurring before and during these policies are in place. And it might be due to a lot of different societal factors, but we're very quick to point to this one.
Yeah, and of course it's a question you can't answer. Well, how would they have, being that black population in that same period of time, how much would they have gained without this
Hmm.
without this act? Maybe it would be less, but who knows? It could have been the same or more. And
Yeah.
but he says instead it's seen as an example of government beneficence and largesse. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, this was given to you by the government.
Hmm.
Well, was it, or is it just going to happen anyway?
Yeah.
And maybe this made it even harder. I don't
Yeah.
know, but
Yeah.
we'll
'Cause that
never
reminds
know,
me.
because it's like that sometimes conservatives often want to say, don't do something, just stand there. Because if you just stand there and don't do anything, you don't screw it up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that reminds. I think you made this point in an earlier chapter, but about I think it was about like education grants for poor communities and stuff like that. And it's like one of those things where it was designed. We're going to have much higher test scores and much bunch of people, in the working the economy. And of course, when those results didn't pan out, then the government response to defending them was, "Would you tell those people, how
Yes.
much this policy failed? Point to those families and tell them that it was a bad thing that they got, that particular grant." That's kind of what you see with a lot of these affirmative action policies. It says, well, we're going to improve everything in the world based on this, and then they sort of shift the goalpost to say, well, you tell that person why he didn't deserve that government funding, why it was a bad thing to give him X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, and that's a kind of childish argument and childish reasoning that we're seeing across a wide spectrum of issues too from the left. Like you're seeing the attempts to cut the federal budget, and you're seeing a post from some like one of my relatives forwarded a post from somebody who worked at the national park, and it's a big long-winded thing, and well, I'm a father, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a wonder, I'm a patriot, and
Hmm.
I got laid off from my dream job. And then you look into the story, it's actually a PBS story. You look into the story, and the person was still a probationary employee. Even though he's 41, he had just been hired at this park as like
Hmm.
some sort of educational person. It wasn't even
Yeah.
somebody that's like doing anything there. like emptying trash or, providing services. It's like one of those environmental education nonsense jobs and make work jobs. And he'd only been there 8 months. And
Hmm.
it's like, okay, well, if we're going to cut staff, isn't he the one we should cut first? I
Yeah.
mean, can we all just agree on that, on the merits?
Hmm.
And sure, it sucks for him, but you got $37 trillion in debt. You can't just keep hiring people. And you can't have these stupid jobs there. And then, of course, there was a famous thing the other day where they laid off the one guy who has the keys to the restrooms at Yosemite National Park. It's like, well, who's the idiot? Whoever, find out who the idiot was that says there's only one person that has access to the keys to the bathroom, and fire that person for incompetence. And how are people getting locked inside bathrooms? How is that? Oh, we need to have the locksmith unlock these people from their bathrooms. The lock's on the inside. What are they? They got doubles on the outside of these bathrooms? Who designed this? Line them all up and fire them.
Oh my gosh. But yeah, that was the affirmative action around the world article. I guess we should move on to the
Yes.
influence of geography.
You know,
And
and I don't know how much we want to go into in depth.
mhm,
This is an excellent argument,
yeah.
excellent article, and I recommend if anybody can find this. I don't know if you can find it
Hmm.
separate from the book, but any of his. I mean, you can find a lot of what Thomas Sowell has written about on the internet, and especially if you use. I was talking before we got started about this AI program, Grok 3.
Hmm.
It's weird. It's like it's reading my mind. Anyway, but he goes through a whole bunch of different examples of how geography, world geography, regional geography, and access to communication and commerce has affected the development of entire populations. And it is a fascinating discussion of how geography and the economics and a culture will change depending on
Hmm.
where the people are.
Yeah.
If you're if you're up like for example, if you're up in the mountains,
Hmm.
it's going to be a more generally a more difficult life, and you're going to be struggling to scratch out a life there. And we all accept that there's certain mountain men that are hardy,
Hmm.
like that culture, like the Scotsmen from the Highlands are great warriors, or other
Yeah.
examples from around the world. Even like the hillbillies in the hills of Appalachia are known
Hmm.
to be really strong and difficult and stubborn people.
Yeah.
Of course, there's overlap genetically between the Scotsmen and
Hmm.
the hillbillies, but in any event, and he's going through, like he talks about the mountains and how that separation by mountains has affected the development of entire communities over time, and especially because they're hard to get up there. It's hard to get materials there. It's hard to
Yeah.
they're not going to interact with other cultures, and they're not
Hmm.
going to get the benefit
Yeah.
from knowing about
Yeah.
advancements in medicine,
And,
commerce,
and then the counterpoint to that is the coastal regions, which he kind of puts
yes,
right after the mountain regions. It's like, yeah, they're going to be generally more technologically and socially advanced than people who are kind of in the interior of a country or up in the mountains somewhere, because they're going to have better access to trade and to information routes and things like that. And sometimes you're going to have very different ethnic populations on the coast than you do in sort of the inside of the country for that exact reason, because of sort of the shifting population and the access to the rest of the world and stuff like that. And he says we're so quick to essentially just describe things towards prejudice and things like that. But really, it's just if you look at the history of a region, what they've had access to in the past, what they have access to now, absolutely shapes, what kind of culture they have. It's not 100% determined. You can always fight against your circumstances, but it's definitely going to have an impact. And he mentions that about land, climate and waterways and things like that. Where it's like, do you have to, have a herding society, or is this a soil good enough for you to sit down and farm to have a more sedentary life? And that's going to greatly impact the resources you have available. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah. Again, I don't know how much detail we want to go into here, but yeah, great
but I mean,
arguments throughout.
yeah, and I like how he mentions that there were studies of immigrants from Italy
Hmm.
or from the Baltic area to either the United States or Australia, and they end up being behind
Yeah.
initially, academically, and they're, well, of course, some of them will be illiterate, but that they economically they're behind because they
Hmm.
won't be able to earn as much per capita. at least for a generation or two before it evens out with whatever culture they're adopting, if assuming that they assimilate into either Australia or the United States. So it's fascinating how those geographic influences on their culture then translate to wherever they move, even if it's in a different geography. At least for that generation or the generation behind it, and it's kind of like a control group to show, well, these things have a lasting impact until you address them with the next generation or a generation
Yeah.
after beyond them. And what I really love about it is well, number one, it's true. It's just is demonstrably true as a group on a whole. Like you said, there's always going to be people that are able to get out, overcome their circumstances. But statistically, as a whole, you have groups of people that are advantage or disadvantage due to the geographic location, and it has nothing to do with somebody oppressing them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there might be oppression on top of it, which doesn't happen, but as far as like a higher, another power, subjugating them or whatever. But it doesn't necessarily have to happen. And then the other people that are doing better, that live on the coastal areas, that are more affluent, they have more educational opportunities, more opportunities to have the resources and the information and the skills to do better
Yeah.
economically or otherwise. So
Yeah.
it's a really, and it's not a moral discussion. It's just a discussion on advantages and disadvantages
Mm-hmm.
that just have to relate to the geographical region
Yeah.
in which people live.
Yeah,
It's
I really
fascinating.
liked his section. He's a section specifically on the geography of Africa, which
Oh
isn't
my
something that
gosh,
I
yes,
consider too often. But he says, well, just from the outset, a desert that's bigger than the width of the United States,
yes.
separating sub-Saharan Africa from Europe, and of course you're surrounded by oceans on each side. Yeah, and his point about the coastline I thought was really really interesting,
Hmm.
because the continent of Africa has a shorter coastline than Europe, even though Europe is a much smaller continent by area, by how you measure, because there's much more inlets, or many more inlets and things like that that provide more natural harbors in Europe. It's but the coastline of Africa, mostly shallow coastal waters, and so you don't have as good of harbors. It's like, yeah, that's something I've never thought of before. That there just wouldn't have been as many good places to trade with the African people throughout much of Africa's history. And he also talks about rivers, right? That the rivers in Africa, because you don't have a big mountain range really through the center of Africa, they're going to be dependent on rainfall rather than snowmelt. And snowmelt leads to more consistent rivers and deeper rivers and things like that. But if it's just based on rainfall, you have a few months throughout the year where the rivers are deep enough to get a ship sort of inland and trade resources and things like that. And when the rain doesn't fall as heavily one year, you're not going to be able to have that trade because it's very much dependent on that. And he also mentions, just with the rivers themselves, they go down like steeper elevation declines at
Yeah,
times, and so it
I
becomes
was not
rapids,
aware.
and you can't
I,
navigate those at any point in time.
I had no idea that almost the entire continent is more than 1,000 feet above sea level.
Yeah.
And he says, as a geographer has put it, the African continent is cursed with a mesa form, which
Hmm.
converts every river into a plunging torrent.
Yeah.
So because of the waterfalls and the elevation changes, you're not able to have navigable rivers for easily moving around freight
Yeah.
and grain and materials. Yeah, I just thought that discussion was fascinating. Of course, he mentions like even the prevalence of tsetse flies,
Hmm.
which transmit diseases so effectively, and so they wouldn't have draft animals even when they're imported because they end up dying and they getting ill and all that sort of thing. And they, if they don't have draft animals in farming, they also don't have fertilizer.
Yeah.
So it's wild a discussion of, because I often wonder, like, well, why can't Africa do so much better?
Hmm.
And like, what is going on over there? Because it's a huge and seemingly beautiful continent with all sorts of natural resources. Well, this, like, why didn't it develop like China did? Why
Hmm.
didn't it develop like Western Europe did? Over the centuries. And I know there have been kingdoms, and of course the Egyptians culture was
Right.
huge and ancient, but of course that's north,
Hmm. That's in the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's above the
Mediterranean,
Sahara. The
area.
Egyptians didn't
Yeah,
penetrate through the Saharan desert.
correct. Right. So it's kind of an interesting discussion of how difficult it is just to move about.
Hmm.
And of course, you're going to have less ability to grow and have a larger civilization, larger cities and states, and be able to even enforce your will upon the population
Hmm.
too. And if you can't move around food, you're going to have a population that's spread out
Yeah.
a lot more. You're not going to be able to centralize because you're
Hmm.
not going to be to be able to get massive amounts of food
Yeah.
into a relatively small area.
Hmm. Yeah. And then
I think
I was going to say he moves on to talk about Eastern and Western Europe. After he talks
yeah,
about Africa and some sort of the differences there, really
yeah,
focusing on the Balkans, because he
yeah,
says, for a lot of Europe, great access to waterways and things like that. You're never really too far from the coast, so it's easy to have international trade and stuff like that. But he says there are parts of Eastern Europe more than 1,000 kilometers from the sea, and you also don't have the influence of the Gulf Stream, which helps keep winters mild. In Eastern Europe, you also have mountains sort of separating you off, and so it's for a long period of history. These regions were sort of condemned to self-sufficiency, is kind of what he says, which is really just you have to rely on your own soil here, and a lot of the times they just don't have access to the same materials. And that's sort of his
and I
point.
thought it was an interesting point where he mentions that like a lot of the even the navigable rivers in Eastern Europe
Hmm.
lead to either lakes or internal bodies of water, as
Yeah.
opposed to the oceans where you'd have international or intercontinental um, uh, transport of people and materials. So I mean,
Hmm.
I don't even think about stuff like
Yeah.
that, but it's brilliant.
And he mentions this is really interesting, the difference between transporting goods by land versus by sea. And he mentions
Mm.
the example of Russia versus Croatia. He says, for a long time the Russians could not, ship grain to Croatia because of, the Ottoman Empire was sort of blocking sea access there from the Black Sea. He says then once a treaty was signed that allowed Russian ships through, they could have large scale grain shipments. He says the difference that this made is indicated by the fact that Russian grain could then undersell Croatian grain on the Dalmatian coast, since the Russian grain was shipped at low cost by water and the Croatian grain by land, even though the latter was shipped for shorter distances. So it's even like the stuff
Yeah,
that is grown within your own country and is certainly closer to where you are living than Russia is, across the Black Sea there. It could be much cheaper to ship things by sea than it is by land,
yeah.
because, just of the difficult terrain and how do you get the animals and things like that to move everything. And, it's just much more expensive. And that's never something I'd thought about. But
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense that just wouldn't
Well,
be as
and
accessible.
it also reminds you how fortunate the United States of America is
Hmm.
with the navigable rivers. You get the
Yeah.
Mississippi that cuts right through the middle of the country, which is navigable all the way up to down to New Orleans,
Hmm.
in the Gulf of America,
Yeah.
and you can ship all the way up to the northern states.
Yeah. And the amount of
And
rivers, large rivers that connect to the Mississippi, that
correct.
branch off east and west to get to all the other
Ohio,
states there. Yeah.
The
Hmm.
Missouri River goes out west and
Yeah.
north, and the Ohio goes up, and then the Illinois River goes up to Lake Michigan, and that goes out to the ocean. Now that of course, they had to do a lot of work as far as there's locks and dams and that kind of stuff to be able to navigate it.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of public improvements that opened up the Great Lakes to seafaring vessels, but it's a great discussion, and I recommend it highly to our listener to get the book and read it just
Yeah.
for this section alone is
Hmm.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And then I think he's already kind of alluded to the geography in Western
Hmm.
in the United States and in North and South America. I don't know. We need to go through that
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, I
It's
think
kind
one
of
of his biggest
a
points was just the access to animals, right? Because he says for so much of
yes,
history, the access to horses, oxen, sheep, and cattle, allowed for Europe and Asia to develop in the way they did. But because
yeah,
you don't have those animals, you don't have those good pack animals to transport goods and things like that. Just there didn't have a society like that develop in North America before the European colonizers.
right,
And so it's you just don't have access to those sorts of things, and that impacts trade and infrastructure connections, and that'll impact
yes.
your whole culture and way of life for generations.
Yeah, and I like his conclusion when he's talking about the Western Europeans coming over to America and confronting the Native Americans. He says the cultural confrontation in the Western Hemisphere was in effect a one-sided struggle between cultures acquired from vast regions of the earth against cultures from a much more narrowly circumscribed regions of the New World. And
Yeah.
that's really true because India describes, I think we talked about like, the rudders from China and the gunpowder from China and this, and they had so many resources from different regions, like the math from, I think this Middle East, maybe Persia or
Hmm.
whatever. They had developed so much from borrowing or stealing or whatever you might want to say from various cultures, and just an exchange of ideas, and it made it so much easier and obvious that it would be the dominant force in the so-called
Yeah.
New World.
Yeah.
Um,
For sure.
wow, it's a great discussion,
Yeah.
and really eye-opening, and I wish there was more discussion along these lines, just so that
Hmm.
people could say, okay, hey, look, let's, like I said at the very beginning, let's talk about what's effective,
Yeah.
and what really, well, the causes that we can control,
Hmm.
because if all you're trying to figure out is how do we correct for the evil people who immorally discriminate against a certain group, you're never going to get there.
Yeah.
You're never going to achieve that just through moralizing and punishing
Hmm.
alone.
Yeah.
And so, what's your solution after we make it illegal? What is your solution after we say, all right, I'm not going to punish you for being a black person, but your competency level isn't up where it needs to be. What's the
Yeah.
solution to that?
Hmm.
Well, it's our schools, our educational system, and our culture. We have to have a culture of excellence,
Hmm.
and for all of us,
Yeah.
and that's the real solution. So how do we get there? And that's the $1 billion question,
Yeah.
$1 trillion question. I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
think it's a problem everywhere. I know I kind of mentioned this last time with my own field of people don't really want to look at history more than 200 years ago, roughly speaking. I think that's everywhere. It's right.
Yeah.
Just as linguists don't really care what Thomas Aquinas or Augustine said about language, but like the fields of politics and ethics and things like that. How much thinkers like that have shaped those fields. But just the bare historical facts, we do not look far enough back in most of our discussions.
Yes.
Most everything, most parts of our discussion, barely go 100 years back, and just discussing, what are the causes of things. But you have to really look at the big picture here before we start blaming and haranguing people for certain actions.
Yes.
Yes.
Good point.
All right. Well, we're actually getting towards the end of the book here. Only three more sections of various articles. So depending on how we split them up, maybe 4 or 5 more episodes. But we've got to think
Nice.
about what we'll be doing for next season.
Yeah, you have to. It's your
Yeah, I'll have to
choice.
come up with something. Yeah, maybe I'll come up with something really weird.
Ooh, yeah, do that. That'd be awesome.
Well, you can, of course, send us suggestions, listeners, all of our many listeners, if you have any, at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. We'll happily take those into account if you want to hear us ramble about some particular topic and/or book. Open call for any suggestions there. But do you have any other final thoughts on this section?
No.
All right. Well, this has been season 10, episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.